Hi, this is Johnny, and I'm going to be talking through the Literacy Assessment Task 3, Assessing Students' Literacy Learning, from the edTPA Elementary Education Assessment. And I'm going to go through this pretty much step by step, so I hope this will be helpful to you. So let's begin. The first two sections, as they are with the other tasks, are about what do I need to think about and what do I need to do. So let's take a look at the what do I need to think about section. In this section, you need to think about evidence, what evidence you're going to gather along the way, and how is that evidence going to help you to make sense of what your students have learned based on what you've set out. How are you going to provide meaningful feedback to your students? And important here is meaningful, not just you did great here, smiley faces, stickers and stars. You need to give meaningful feedback that sets students up to continue to learn in regards to the essential literacy strategy and related skills, so meaningful feedback that promotes their learning. Next, how will you use evidence of what students know and are able to do to plan next steps in instruction, right? So thinking about the instructional cycle, you use assessment to set up planning for your next lessons. And then an important thing that runs throughout edTPA is a focus on language, especially academic language. So you're going to have to give evidence of how students used language throughout your teaching and throughout the lessons, and particularly in your assessment, to show how they've been growing in their language use. So let's look at the what do I need to do section now. And this is very practical. So let's go through this step by step. First off, you need to make sure that you're working from one assessment, not multiple assessments. So you want to be very clear about that in your planning. What assessment do you want to have that you set up through planning that will do the most work for you, and really focus students on showing what they understand about the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. Now, this assessment needs to be completed by the whole class, all right? And the assessment should reflect the work of individuals, so it can't be a group work assignment. And of course, the two things that this assessment should focus on, as I've said, the essential literacy strategy and related skills. So one assessment that shows students understanding, developing knowledge and skills in regards to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Now the next one's more work and very, very important, and I'll explain why. You want to define and submit evaluation criteria. The criteria you set up and out for your assignment should be in regards to the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. The evaluation criteria are going to set up your analysis of students' work, and based on that analysis you should be talking about and writing about these two. So evaluation criteria need to be in line with your expectations for these things. Next, you'll need to collect and analyze the students' work, and you want to think about it in terms of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis, and what edTPA talks about in terms of patterns of learning. So this is what they say about patterns of learning. So edTPA offers this definition. It says patterns of learning, both quantitative and qualitative patterns or consistencies for different groups of students and individuals. Quantitative patterns indicate in a numerical way the information understood from the assessment. So example is 10 out of 15 students or 20% of the students. Qualitative patterns include descriptions of understandings, misunderstandings, or developmental approximations that could explain the quantitative patterns. So the example is, given that most students were able to, it seems that they understand. So you want to think about both the quantitative and the qualitative parts of the analysis. So the work itself may be in the form of text files, scanned student work, or oral assessments of primary grade students. So if you're working in a kindergarten or first grade classroom, having a conversation with students that you've audio recorded or video recorded can be used as evidence. All right. So the examples they give for a primary class could be happening during a read aloud, dictating text, or orally demonstrating the essential literacy strategy, and of course a video or audio file. So you want to keep in mind text files, audio files, video files are all ways to collect students' work. If you need to add something for each focus student, you may include a video or audio work sample, and it can't be more than 5 minutes long. So this is collect and analyze student work. Next, we need to think about your 3 focus students. So you want to choose 3 students that represent the patterns of learning. An example, what students generally understood or what they struggled with. So the 3 focus students are representative of important things that happened in your lessons, right? So you want them to show things that most kids were doing or that you have particular interest in. If you choose 3 focus students where they all did well across all the assessment you set out for the essential literacy strategy and related skills, then you may not be capturing the kinds of struggles that other students had. So you want these 3 students to be representative of the kinds of things that happen within your classroom. And it's important to think about these 2 things always, what's understood and what struggles still remain. These 2 go together. What do kids learn and what are they still working to learn? These students will be your focus students, and at least one of the focus students must have specific learning needs, and some examples down here: IEP, English learner, 504 plan, a struggling reader or writer, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on this on the next page. Let's summarize what we have from this first page. First off, this top section, what do I need to think about? The important things that come from that. 3 things. You want to be focusing on evidence for learning. What kinds of evidence do you have to show what students have learned? You want to be thinking about feedback that promotes learning, and you want to be considering the language use students exhibit throughout the learning segments. So these 3 things matter within this assessment task: evidence, feedback, language use. Keep those in mind. Next, about the evaluation criteria. The evaluation criteria should be focused on the essential literacy strategy and related skills. So you could set out evaluation criteria for any number of things, like writes neatly or uses correct punctuation, but if those things aren't embedded in the essential literacy strategy or related skills, then those things probably shouldn't be part of your evaluation criteria. So just remember, your evaluation criteria should set you up to be able to analyze your students' understandings of these things. And lastly, your focus students' work. So these 3 focus students, they should represent 2 things: the general understandings that were going on in your class, and also the kinds of struggles that were evident across the class or with those 3 students. So you want to make sure that you set yourself up to have a rich picture of what's going on in your classroom for the rich analysis and discussion that you'll write up later on. Let's look at the next page. The top of this page continues describing the 3 focus students. So let's make sure we have these understood. There are special considerations if you're a teacher in California. So the 3 focus students you choose, if you're able to, you should choose 1 student who is an English language learner. And this is a requirement in California. But you also have a caveat. If you're in a class within California and you find that you don't have an English learner to include within your focus students, then you should find a student who is challenged by academic English. All right? So that's a special requirement for California. Let's talk about feedback now. Now the feedback can come in different forms. And the feedback could be on the work samples, some things that you've written down, and I would suggest you do that regardless. In audio clips that you've captured as you've worked with students, or the video clip, which will also include audio along with the video. Okay? And this is important, very important. You must submit evidence of the actual feedback. You can't say, well, I gave them feedback and it was about this. It needs to be time-stamped in the video, time-stamped in an audio clip, or noted on a work sample. So those things have to be given in those forms. Next, if you have a challenge getting good evidence in terms of the feedback, you can annotate, you can attach a transcription to the inaudible comments, you can embed quotes with timestamps on the video, or you can insert captions in the video as well. So this paragraph here is all about how to manage feedback that's not readily available to the reader of this assessment. So consider these things if you have trouble with the audio or the video. Okay? The other thing that you need to consider is pointing out who's being considered or who's being given the feedback. So if you submit a student work sample or feedback as a video or audio clip and additional students are present, clearly identify which students are your focus students. All right? And that's to help the reader know why you're giving the feedback to that person, and as you describe it in your commentary later, it makes sense who your focus students are. What follows after that, you will necessarily have to respond to the commentary in the literary assessment commentary. You will also need to include and submit the chosen assessment, including the directions prompts provided to students. You want to attach the assessment, this is a blank assessment, with no more than 5 additional pages, all right? And then lastly, this is all about evidence, this task. You want to provide evidence of students' understanding and use of the targeted academic language function and other language demands, all right? And it's a smart thing to use evidence from the videos that you made for the instruction task 2, but you're also allowed to have an additional video clip of one or more students using the language, but that video clip can't be more than 5 minutes in length, and or include student work samples as part of the evidence. Now, in order to manage all these materials, edTPA suggests that you refer to this document, because this will set out what matters to you along the way, okay, about how to collect and submit your evidence. So let's look at these notes. First off, you want to be smart about feedback. You want to include written and spoken feedback as evidence. So because you're offered both, it makes sense to do both. Written feedback should have rich descriptions of what students should be working towards, not just descriptions of good and bad marks or congratulatory marks. Make sure it's rich feedback. And in this comment, remember that you will need to show students' use of language in your lessons, evidence from the video clips, and from student work again. Okay. So let's go on to the commentary. Okay. Now, to begin with, if your evidence is not clear about language use and such, you want to make sure that you include, you want to attach the assessment used to evaluate student performance, no more than 5 additional pages, a transcription of inaudible portions of a video clip or audio clip of feedback or student work samples, and you can't have more than 2 additional pages of this. So if you're needing to add evidence about feedback, make sure you include these things. All right? Now, let's look at the actual prompts. And as I've said before, you want to make sure that you're addressing every prompt fully. One of the reasons why I've colored these in different colors is because you want to make sure that you're looking at all the parts of each prompt. Okay, so let's begin. The first section is analyzing student learning. And in this section, you want to start by identifying the specific learning objectives, the ones you set out in your planning, that are measured by the assessment. All right? You want to provide a graphic, table, or chart, or you could do a narrative that summarizes the student learning for your whole class. And then you want to make sure that summary for student learning covers all the evaluation criteria that you've set out. Now, you can choose between setting out a table or chart or a narrative. Table and charts offer some advantages. I'm going to share that with you right now. A narrative might include those things as well, but the challenge with the narrative is that you might not have as much opportunity to do quantitative analysis of students' whole class performance as you do for qualitative analysis. So let's take a look at an example. So here's an example of a graphic or table that summarizes student learning. And in this you can see the evaluation criteria are set out here clearly. And what's nice about this one, it states what the essential literacy strategy was, summarizing a fable rubric. So they're summarizing a fable, and this particular rubric has these criteria. Okay, so the criteria fit with the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. And then in this, you can see that this person has set up the table to look at students being proficient in this, approaching this particular criterion, or emerging. And you can see there are tally marks here to show how well students have done and the numbers of students who've worked towards each of these criteria. Now, what's useful about this is that there's a lot of analysis possible right from the start. We can look at any one of the criteria and look across and decide whether that criterion was something that students found easy or challenging. So if we look at this one, we can see this first criterion includes main characters and describes their character traits. 22 students did this well, and one student had a bit of struggle. If we go down to say the last criterion, we can see concept blurb includes the title of the fable, the moral learned, and why the story is useful, and a concluding transition word. And in this particular criterion, 10 students were proficient and 11 were approaching and 2 were emerging. So we can clearly see that this was more of a struggle for students than this one. And that's what a narrative can't do for you, but a table or chart will do for you. So you can see the importance of setting out your evaluation criteria here and clearly showing how students performed against those criteria. So the next part, after you've set out that graphic, table, or chart, you want to summarize the learning. So you want to talk about the patterns that I just shared with you in that example table. And then you want to talk about your 3 focus students, right? So the 3 student work samples, the 3 focus students. You want to look for patterns of learning that describe both the 3 students and the whole class. All right, so make sure you describe both of them. Use evidence found in the 3 student work samples and the whole class summary to analyze patterns of learning. All right, for the whole class. And essential to this prompt is that after you've talked about the whole class, or after you've written about the whole class, you need to say something about individual differences for groups of learners. Okay, differences for groups or for individual learners. And as always, these need to focus on the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. Okay, so something important here, this analysis, the analysis of the patterns of learning needs to include something. And they need to include these things: what students understand and do well, and where they continue to struggle. Okay, so as you do this analysis, talk about your whole class, talk about your students in terms of what they can do, and also what they're struggling to do. All right? And finally, on this first section of analyzing student learning, if you have focus students in the video clip, you need to state how you may recognize them by what they're wearing or where they're sitting. All right? And that's a pretty straightforward request. Let's look at the next section, which is feedback to guide further learning. Now, the first statement says, refer to specific evidence of submitted feedback. Again, this is about what you've written on student work or the audio portions of audio clips or video clips. All right? So you need to say this next part, A, you need to say or state which form are you using. Okay? So written on the work samples, audio files, or video clips. Okay? And again, if you're using video or audio, you need to help the reader or the viewer or the listener know who you're talking about, who are the focus students. Next, you need to explain how feedback provided to the 3 focus students addresses their individual strengths and needs relative to the learning objectives measured. So this has to be about each one of them. And my suggestion is that you write a paragraph for each focus student. Focus student 1, focus student 2, focus student 3. And for each one of those focus students, you need to do 2 things. The strengths of focus student 1 were describing the strengths and using evidence from their work sample or from the video clips, as you can see in the video clip at this point in time, as you can see from student 1's work. But then you also have to describe their needs, and using evidence again, you can see that student 1 needs to do this based on this interaction at 3:22 in the second clip, or the student needs to do this or to improve this by doing this based on what's evident in the work sample here, and then using a quote or the text from the work sample. So the important thing here, and this is a very heavy, important prompt, what does your feedback do in regards to encouraging them or acknowledging their strengths and giving direction and support to their needs? The feedback needs to do these 2 things. All right? Then you need to follow with describing how you will support each focus student to understand and use this feedback to further their learning related to the learning objectives. So you might take this as justifying your feedback. How does this feedback, how will this feedback move them? And then what might you do after or in the next lesson to support students to use that feedback to further their learning? All right? So let's take a look at some notes. Let's go back up to organizing your table. So again, important, organize your table or chart around your evaluation criteria. And I showed you what that looks like on this table. You can clearly see the evaluation criteria along here. And that just sets you up for good analysis. So you want to remember that there are 2 layers to your analysis. The default would be to talk about your whole class. Whole class is great, but you also need to talk about groups or individuals. So make sure you note that. Your analysis should talk about whole class patterns, but then groups or individuals. 3 of my students were doing these things. This one particular student was showing this kind of understanding. And that should follow your whole class analysis, okay? And obviously focus the analysis on the essential literacy strategy and related skills. All right? So the analysis should focus on these 2 things. And as I've said before, show what students understand and show what they're continuing to learn or struggle with. Next, about feedback. Feedback should be more than congratulatory or what's right or wrong. Feedback should give students direction to the learning of the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Okay? And that will all set you up for B and C down here. And lastly, strengths and needs. You want to describe these for each of your 3 focus students. So explain how feedback provided to the 3 focus students addresses their individual strengths and needs. 1 paragraph would be smart for each one of your 3 focus students, and in each paragraph describing their strengths and describing their needs, supported by evidence from their work, okay, from their work sample or from evidence within the video clips. Now let's go to this next section. So, evidence of language understanding and use. So far we've talked about collecting evidence and we've talked about feedback. This is the 3rd major piece of the assessment task, is thinking about language use. So, in this section, you want to give concrete examples, always evidence and evidence, from the video clips with timestamps, and then quotes or evidence from the student work samples, all right? And the evidence from the video clips may focus on 1 or more students, so you could use 1 student as an example or collections of students. Okay, so this is all about language use and how you're going to show how language was used in your lessons, what forms, all right? Now, this description that follows is about those evidence forms. You may provide evidence of students' language use from 1, 2, or all 3 of the following sources. It might be smart to use more than 1. Let's just say that. You may find it easiest to use the work samples and the video clips to provide evidence of students' language use. All right? So here it says you may use video clips from Literacy Instruction Task 2. Make sure you timestamp the references. You could add an additional video file called language use, but it can't be more than 5 minutes long. And of course, you could use student work samples. All right? Let's go to the next section. And this is about describing how language was used within your teaching by your students. So, explain and provide concrete examples, again the evidence that comes from this section up here, for the extent to which your students were able to use or struggled to use. Okay, so again the dichotomy, what were they able to do and what were they struggling to do? So whenever you see an or like that, make sure you address both parts. What did they do with language that made sense and worked? What things did they struggle to do with language? And of course, you want to think about these in terms of the language function, you know, whether they were justifying or persuading or explaining. Then, of course, the vocabulary or key phrases, and, it's a little bit tricky, discourse or syntax. You might try to attempt both discourse and syntax if it makes sense for what you've been teaching. All right? Not having one of these 3 will be trouble. So make sure you really do give evidence for each one of these. A suggestion to you would be a paragraph about the language function, a paragraph about vocabulary, and a paragraph about discourse or syntax, just to keep yourself honest. In edTPA, if you see bulleted points, that means you need to address each one of the bulleted points. The last part of this is, now that you've done your analysis, what do you make of it? And based on that analysis, how might you teach this lesson differently? So using assessment to inform instruction. Based on your analysis of student learning, describe next steps for instruction, okay, to impact student learning. And again, 2 bulleted points, and you want to address each of these. So what would your next steps for instruction be for the whole class? Based on your analysis, looking at your chart again, What would your next steps be for the 3 focus students based on their student work samples or from the whole class analysis again? So whatever you're deciding to do for next steps, it has to come from what you've set out in your analysis of students' work. Okay? Now, whenever they say 3 focus students, you want to consider the variety of learners in your class. All right. And then down here, explain how these next steps follow from your analysis of student learning. Support your explanation with principles from research and/or theory. So this B follows a well-described section on next steps for whole class and 3 focus students. Then you justify it with principles from research and/or theory. So make sure you have this solid before moving to this one. Let's look at the key ideas. So for the first part, the evidence of language, understanding, and use. Important to state timestamps for video evidence, and also consider quoting text from the work samples. This is evidence, all right? Evidence, evidence, evidence. Now the next part, explaining and providing concrete examples for the extent to which your students were able to use or struggle to use these various language demands. You want to address each of these, right? Do not miss one of these bulleted points. And if you can elaborate on both discourse and syntax, the better. So do not miss any one of these 3, all right? And remember, the evidence for these comes from video or an additional language use video or from work samples. All of these support what you see in these, okay? Next, make sure you describe changes based on what you found in a student's work. When it says based on your analysis, that means going back to the first prompts that you have in this section and looking at what you said about the whole class and what you said about patterns of learning and what you said about your 3 focus students. Based on those, then describe your next steps. Okay? Make sure you describe changes intended for both the whole class and for the 3 focus students. Again, the 2 bulleted points. Based on your analysis, for whole class, I intend to do these things. Based on my analysis of my 3 focus students, I intend to do these things, all right? So think about it organized that way. You could imagine separate paragraphs for each of these. It's possible. And then lastly down here, explain the next step, how these next steps follow from your analysis of student learning. Support your explanation with principles from research and/or theory. The changes must follow from your analysis, right? The principles from research and theory should include a focus on literacy learning. So there's lots of good research out there on how students learn to read or how students learn to write. You could include general learning theory, but it's not going to be as potent as if you describe research or theories that focus on reading texts or composing texts. So try to keep that in mind as you address this prompt, all right? And remember, these next steps must follow from your analysis, so the research or theory should fit with your analysis too. Let's get to the rubrics. There'll be 5 rubrics again. And let's start with this first one. Rubric 11, Analysis of Student Learning. So, sorry for the interruption. Let's take a look at this. Rubric 11, Analysis of Student Learning. Okay. How does the candidate analyze evidence of student learning related to the essential literacy strategy and related skills? Okay, so this is all about your analysis. And remember, it's always focused on the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Okay, for a 3 on this, the analysis focuses on what students did right and wrong. And analysis includes some differences in whole class learning. All right, you want to be shooting for a 4. And take a look at 4. Let's see what 4 does that's different than 3. The analysis uses specific examples from work samples to demonstrate patterns of learning consistent with a summary. Now you can see some differences here. Uses specific examples. So that's why you need to be pulling out examples from your video with timestamps and using quotes and text from your student work samples. So you want to have specific examples, all right? And you want those to be about patterns of learning, not about just what's right and wrong. What kinds of things were going on across the class? What general understandings did they have or struggles did they have? Okay? The next part, and patterns of learning are described for whole class. Under 3, its analysis includes some differences in whole class learning. On level 4, its patterns of learning are described for the whole class. So you want to be using the phrase patterns of learning, and you want to be describing things in your analysis in terms of patterns of learning rather than what's just right or wrong, and that will move you to a 4. The next rubric, rubric 12, providing feedback to guide further learning. What type of feedback does the candidate provide to focus students? Under a 3, feedback is specific and addresses either needs or strengths related to the learning objectives. You can already see what the difference will be with 4. Let's take a look at 4. Feedback needs to be specific again, but what you can see here is that feedback addresses both strengths and needs related to the learning objectives. So when you're writing the commentary on your feedback and what it's supposed to do for your focus students, you need to include for each one of the focus students, this feedback is addressing this strength, this feedback is addressing this student's needs, and you need to do that for each of the students. So the difference between a 3 and a 4 is one word essentially, which is or versus and. Okay? Strengths and needs. The next rubric, this is rubric 13, student understanding and use of feedback. How does the candidate support focus students to understand and use the feedback to guide their further learning? Under 3, the candidate describes how focus students will understand or use feedback related to the learning objectives. Okay. Now you should look for key words again here. The difference with 4. In 4, you can see that the candidate describes how she or he will support, okay, focus students to understand and use feedback, not too different than the original, feedback on their strengths or weaknesses related to the learning objectives. Okay, so you can see here, this first one says the candidate, for 3, it says the candidate describes how focus students will understand or use. So that's what the students will do. But under 4, it's what the teacher will do, how he or she will focus students and support students with that feedback. And again, focused on strengths or weaknesses. If you can write about both, you're doing better. Here, there's no mention under 3 of either strengths or weaknesses. So as you're describing your work to support students in the use of the feedback, include commentary on strengths and weaknesses you're addressing in that support. The next rubric, so this is 14, analyzing students' language use and literacy learning. How does the candidate analyze students' use of language to develop content understanding? Under a 3, which is passing, candidate explains and provides evidence of students' use of the language function and one or more additional language demands, vocabulary, syntax, discourse. Now remember when I talked to you a moment ago, there were 3 bullet points, and level 3 is being a bit kind, saying that you should think about 2 of them, but it'd be nice if you addressed all 3. So let's see what 4 does. Okay, under 4, it asks a bit more. Under 4, Candidate explains and provides evidence of students' use of, so far the same, the language function, vocabulary, and additional language demands, syntax, or discourse. All right? So you can see already that there are 3 things that you'll need to be considering in your commentary to get a 4. If you only do language function and one of the other ones, if you've only done 2 consideration of the language demands, then you'll probably get a 3. But if you address 3 considerations under the language demands, the function, the vocabulary, and either syntax or discourse, then you're doing better. And then you want to relate how that language develops content understandings, your essential literacy strategy and related skills again. Okay? So it's not just about the language use. What does that language use do for the learning of the topic you've set out? And that will take you to a 4. And lastly, rubric 15, using assessment to inform instruction. How does the candidate use the analysis of what students know and are able to do to plan next steps in instruction? A 3, which is passing. Next steps propose general support that improves student learning related to the assessed learning objectives. Next steps are loosely connected with research and/or theory. We already see a word here we need to be considering here, this loosely word. All right? Now, this first part, the key word here is general support. All right? Take a look at 4 and you can see a difference already. Under 4, level 4, which you want to aspire to, you want the next steps to provide targeted support to individuals or groups to improve their learning. All right? So we move from general to targeted support, and we're thinking about individuals or groups. All right? So not only is the support targeted, but it's particular to groups or individual students. And it's relative to the 2 things we care about, the essential literacy strategy or the related skills, which aren't mentioned here. So your next steps for level 3 could be very general about improving student learning. But to get a 4, you need to have targeted support, and it needs to be focused again on what the next steps would be related to your essential literacy strategy and or the related skills. Now, let's look at the last statement. Next steps are loosely connected with research and or theory. To have a 4, you want the next steps to be connected with research and or theory. And my suggestion was that you focus on theory that is particular to the learning of literacy skills, reading and composing text. And that will take you to a 4. So I've gone through the literacy assessment task for the edTPA elementary education assessment. I've talked through the requirements, I've gone through the commentary, and I've also given a detailed account of the considerations within the rubrics. I hope that this activity or this talk will help you to do well on your assessment.